Thanks very much, Lucy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's the sort of bee plant-wise theme, and what I would like to do is sort of incentivize that prevention message by explaining what an absolute nightmare it is when we don't prevent biological invasions, and we actually have to then take intervention actions against them. So for the presentation, I'll basically go through what we call the hierarchy of invasive species management. And as a sort of example of early intervention, I'll describe the action we're taking against water primrose. And then for the sort of containment, floating pennywort, and then at the sort of the strategic management, then I'll look at sort of just touch on the biocontrol. And then just right at the end, I'll just pick up on some sort of other species and emerging threats that that you might be interested to hear about. So in terms of a sort of traditional approach to resources for invasive species management, we're not great at prioritizing prevention. We very rarely have enough resource for rapid response, and it's human nature that we are motivated by the problems that we have in front of us. And so we tend to not really take much action until the problem is actually so well established that there isn't much we can do other than at sort of local level. And so it's sort of skewed towards spending a lot on long-term control of the species that we know have become a problem. And the cost benefit of that is actually less favorable than a sort of the hierarchical approach, which is where prevention is by far the most cost beneficial intervention we can take. One of the problems with prevention, of course, is that if you're really good at it, nothing happens. And so sometimes it's quite hard to justify that cost. But if prevention does fail, then there's sometimes a window of opportunity for a rapid response and to eradicate the problem. And if you're unsuccessful with that, or if it's a species for which there isn't really any viable means of management, then you do have to look at some sort of long-term control. But these sort of boxes should sort of represent that resource allocation. Really, prevention is our best option. And for the purposes of plants, we have our Bee Plant-Wise campaign, which is a brilliant campaign for gardeners and the horticulture industry. And we also have Check Clean Dry, which is more geared towards water users, paddlers, anglers, etc. So these are very good tailored campaigns to try to address the behaviours that spread invasive species. But for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to focus on what happens when prevention fails and what our options are for interventions. So there's a sort of classic invasion curve model, and as the sort of as a species goes through that sort of exponential growth phase, our ability to eradicate it declines. Now, the intriguing part of an invasion curve is the what we call the lag phase. And that's a sort of phase where the organism appears to not be particularly invasive. It just sort of bumbles along, and it's quite hard sometimes to predict whether it actually subsequently will become invasive or how long that lag phase might be. For woody perennial species like trees, it's over 100 years quite often before it becomes invasive. For so a lot of the aquatic species, that lag phase is actually often quite a short period of time, only a few years. But it does give us a window of opportunity if we do believe that it is a problem to actually take early intervention eradication. And this is a good example where there was a species that's got a very clunky name, unfortunately, various leaf water milfoil, Myriophyllum heterophyllum. This is a plant that is actually listed as a species of concern within the EU and within the UK. We know it's a problem because it's a problem in mainland Europe. It was found at one site, Horsham, and we have subsequently eradicated it. So, that is a species that we believe we've eradicated. We've eradicated all known populations, but this is quite a tricky species to identify. The um, the the sort of the submerged phase, which is the bit on the left-hand side there, looks very much like a whole range of other Myriophyllum, some of which are native. And we do know that this particular one site came in as a contaminant to ornamental aquatic plants. So if it's a contaminant in the trade, there's a distinct possibility it is elsewhere. So it's a tentative eradication for this one, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it cropped up somewhere else. But this is the one I'd particularly like to focus on, Ludwigia grandiflora, water primrose. I'm relieved to say this picture wasn't taken in the UK. I'd be crying in my beer if it was, but this is actually from France, where they've had it a lot longer than us. It was introduced in the 19th century there, and it's shown its true colours over there. It's a really persistent invasive species of canals, ditches, ponds, lakes, water, wetlands, etc. So we're confident we don't want this one. This is a really bad one. And we have instigated an eradication program against this. If you're struggling with the legend, the green dots are the ones that we believe we've eradicated, and the amber ones are the ones that are actually under management. But you can see that there's a general sort of southerly distribution, but there are sites up as far as Yorkshire where it has established, and so it can survive in the north, and where it does grow, it can grow extremely well. So we know that it would be a problem here were we to leave it. And it was actually captured within the sort of first economic assessment on invasive species that was done in 2010. I mean, these are old figures. When this statement was written, we thought we had 13 sites. We now have 54 sites. So the 73,000 is very optimistic. I'm afraid the bill is going to be more than that. But I also suspect that the 242 million is also a conservative figure. What it does emphasize is that there is a huge cost benefit to a rapid response eradication to species such as this. And what does it do? Well, you've seen what it can do in terms of biodiversity to a wetland. Well, this is another site in France, I'm relieved to say. It just goes to show how it's affected the ecosystem quite profoundly in this area above this impoundment, and from a point of view of flood risk, navigation, recreational use, angling, etc. This site is very degraded because of the presence of water primrose. And it's not just northwest Europe where it's invasive. This is Lake Biwa in Japan, and water primrose is becoming a really big problem in the big Japanese lakes, and not just the lakes. It's also invading the rice paddy fields. So it's becoming a really damaging weed to their rice production, which obviously you can imagine is a considerable worry to them. So where is it occurring in the UK? Well, I tend to refer to them sort of primary sites. So at the moment, it hasn't properly got out that we're aware of. It's mostly in sites where it was probably originally introduced, such as ponds, lakes, fisheries, Gulf lakes, urban lakes. It is beginning to get out of ponds, etc. We often find it in those sustainable urban drainage schemes, and it is beginning to appear in some lakes and things that are draining to rivers. So we're not complacent with this, but so far, where we have found it have been areas that are still manageable. So eradication is still an achievable option based on what we found so far. So it's introduced as an ornamental aquatic plant. It actually wasn't a particularly popular plant with the ornamental trade because it has quite a rambling growth. So it wasn't heavily marketed, but unfortunately it was marketed enough for it to actually be distributed. It was first found in the wild in 1998. That was the Barn Elms Wetland Centre near London, where it has subsequently been eradicated. We started the eradication program 16 years ago now, and as I say, we had about a dozen sites then. Um, it's it was banned from sale in 2010. It was one of the first species to be banned from sale. So its window of distribution has actually been fairly small, but this is still the legacy of that period in which it was sold. Sorry, it was banned from sale in 2014. It was illegal to allow it to spread, so it was listed on the Wildlife and Countryside Act 2010, and then there's a subsequent ban on sale 2014. As I say, currently we have 54 known locations, of which 24 we believe are eradicated. So we had a bad year last year. We had sort of 5 new sites, but until then we sort of had about half of them eradicated. So how does it spread? As I say, this is the residue of a fairly small window of trading on water primrose, which is quite sobering, really. But it's very rare for landowners to acknowledge where it came from. It's very rare for anyone to say, "Oh, I bought it from the garden centre." And bearing in mind that chances are when they bought it, it was probably perfectly legal to do so. But a lot of people sort of say it just sort of appeared from nowhere. And this is where people often want to blame birds. They want to blame birds for lots of things, especially spreading invasive species. I'm not convinced that birds are a major vector for Ludwigia, largely because of this species, which is Ludwigia paploides, which is a close relative. And this is another invasive Ludwigia as a real problem, possibly even a bigger problem in Northwest Europe than grandiflora. But as you can see from its distribution, it's not in the UK. At least we haven't found it yet. So if birds were spreading Ludwigia seed or propagules from mainland Europe, then we would expect to see paploides appear because it would be using that same pathway. And the fact that we haven't does suggest that that we can't blame the birds. So we have a program of eradication. And to sum it up in one sentence, every year, every stem of water primrose will be destroyed by whatever means best prevents its future reappearance. So thankfully, there are a range of methods, which I will describe later, that we have found to be effective against water primrose. What's really important is to try to make sites biosecure and to prevent further spread. That's sometimes challenging if the site has a hydrological link to a river that we can't maintain, but we can put screens in, and it's always really important to prevent seed set as well. Not all water primrose infestations set seed. It is quite a complex sort of situation, depending on the physiology of the flower. But where there is seed set, obviously there's a real biosecurity risk. We've just introduced management plans for each of the sites that are in management, and we're also really keen to get reports on new sites. I mean, this is crucial because they're still out there. And obviously, if we don't know about them, then the chances are they're not being managed. And that is a real risk that one day we'll find a site that it's almost unfeasible to actually eradicate it. And that's what keeps me up at night. So in terms of what the eradication sort of looks like in terms of progress, the black line at the top is the total number of sites we've had recorded since 2012. The dashed line in the middle is the total number of actual sites minus the eradicated sites. And the little dotted line at the bottom is just the year-on-year number of new sites we get reported. And as you can say, it was sort of plateauing quite nicely up to last year. And then we had a bit of a bad year for new sites. And it is slightly depressing because, you know, the dashed line is still on an upwards migration. So we're still getting more sites than we're eradicating. But when you compare this against that, classic exponential growth of an invasion, you realize that at the very, very least, we're really dampening that curve. And in that itself is quite an achievement. And then when you compare it with the next plant that I will describe, which is floating pennywort, you can see that that has sort of gone through a sort of more of a classic exponential growth. And that's where we were unable to, excuse me, that's where we were unable to actually particularly, to dampen that curve. So in terms of what we do, we're increasingly looking at chemical control. And we've recently got a permit to use a product called triclopyr. And triclopyr is not normally approved, but for use in or near water. But we have got a 3-year permit to use it for this specific purpose against water primrose. And that's quite exciting because, well, it's exciting to me. It's probably, it's an acquired taste. But glyphosate has proved effective, but we believe that triclopyr will be more effective. And what's interesting about triclopyr is that it has a different mode of action to glyphosate. It's an auxin based product, so it actually makes the plant grow itself to death. Hence, you get this twisted appearance, and it's particularly good against the more woody plants, which Ludwigia actually is. Whereas the glyphosate, it actually attacks a specific metabolic pathway. And generally, glyphosate works better in autumn, just before the plant naturally dies back, and it's very good for translocating down to the rhizome and roots. So they have different modes of action and also different times of year for their action. So we can be doing a sort of spring, summer triclopyr hit, and then if there's any left over, hitting it with glyphosate in the autumn. And if you want to be especially mean, you could even do a summer, autumn tank mix of triclopyr and glyphosate. We can only do a single application per year, so it is important that we time that really well and make sure it's done very thoroughly. But we're hopeful that triclopyr will really be a game changer with some of our more persistent sites. So in terms of mechanical control, I mean, this is very useful sometimes if you get a new site and there's a very high biomass of weed that sometimes it's useful just to sort of clear that biomass and then treat the fresh growth. And what you tend to do is, as you say, use machinery to remove that big biomass and then use chemical and manual methods afterwards to mop up what regrows. One of the challenges with this is actually finding a means of disposing of it, because you can get very large volumes of what is very wet, silty, weedy waste, and obviously how you transport and dispose of that is a biosecurity risk. So there are only certain ways in which it can be done safely. But we're increasingly looking at, especially with small ponds, it's so hard to kill this plant that sometimes it's easier just to fill the pond in and start again. It might sound like a rather sort of draconian approach, but often that is just the quickest, surest way of actually dealing with it. And then the manual removal, if it's a small infestation, if it's a garden pond, or if it's regrowth from another control program, then this is a really good, if it's done sort of thoroughly. And as you see here in the picture, you can have quite a dense rhizome with this. So it's important you just don't pull it up, because you're just going to be cropping it. You've got to be able to carefully remove it if you're going to eradicate it using this method. But it also helps if you cut back other vegetation, because it's that sometimes it can lurk amongst other plants. So controlling other types of vegetation is actually quite important, really, for all of these programs. I won't dwell too much on these, but this is a graph of the methods that we use to treat sites that have been eradicated, and the blue is herbicide treatment, the red is manual removal, and the green is mechanical removal. And I suppose what it does show is that there are sites where manual removal has eradicated it. There are a few sites where purely herbicide has as well, but quite a few of them are initially herbicide, then manual removal. Whereas if you compare that with, these are sites that have yet to be eradicated. And if you look on the y-axis, years of treatment, some of these sites have been in treatment for 15 years now, and they're still going. And it's not through any want of trying. As you can see that, for some of these sites, there have been mechanical, manual, and chemical treatments undertaken. So this is a tough plant to kill, especially in certain situations. So in terms of comparing those treatment options, it's hard to see a pattern. There isn't a silver bullet for how we get rid of this plant yet. And a lot of those sites are very variable. Some of them are a tiny garden pond, others are, very large lakes. So it would be wrong to read too much into those graphs. But what is clear is that some of these treatments are taking a very long time, and we do need to drill down in terms of why they're taking so long. Sometimes sites seem to get into a habit of cropping rather than eradicating it. So we're trying to change the emphasis more towards a very focused eradication program. And hence the gone in 5, what we've set the target that no site should take more than 5 years to eradicate, which might be ambitious, but it's useful to have a deadline to focus on. So what have we learnt so far? What we're doing works. If it's completed diligently, it's really important that things are done very thoroughly. But we are very good at reducing the biomass. Those sites where it has persisted, what is growing there is a fraction of what was originally there or what would have been there had it not been managed. But the swift eradication is a methodology that hasn't yet been refined. So we do need to do more work on how we actually properly eradicate this. And also we do need to find these, we had 5 new sites, which when you think that the last water primrose was sold in 2014, to be having these new sites is slightly concerning. So we do need to get better at finding these sites. And having reviewed the program, what we're encouraging is that more sites are just infilled if they're small, and if the landowner agrees, we just fill them in and dig another one. We do need to refine our methods of management, and we're hoping that the use of triclopyr will actually assist that process. We've got very high hopes for our triclopyr program, and we have to make sure that there is a good management plan in place, and at least one annual visit a year to make sure that that management plan is being undertaken thoroughly. And if they don't work after 5 years, then we need to review that plan and see what we need to do differently. And we have had an independent audit of our program, and that's something that I would certainly encourage in future. A fresh pair of eyes is really useful. But also, we're really indebted to the Secretariat and all those other bodies that have promoted better recording of water primrose, because we do need to know those as yet undiscovered sites. So I hope that water primrose will be eradicated eventually. I'd be very disappointed if we failed in that. But there are some for which eradication, unfortunately, is no longer an option, and one of those is almost certainly floating pennywort. Similarly introduced in the 80s and 90s as a pond plant, and it has now become an extremely well established and very, very problematic invasive species. So we sort of tried to develop a strategy, and we had some really good engagement from various NGOs and government bodies. But we just cannot secure strategic funding. And I argue that without strategic funding, a strategy isn't a strategy really. So that's the bad news. We don't really have a funded strategy to manage floating pennywort. We do get piecemeal funding, and there are some really good local success stories, but that isn't strategic funding. And it's continuing to spread, and it's likely to continue to spread for a considerable period of time. And what's worrying is that this is a plant that, under climate change predictions, is likely to thrive. So time is against us with this one. And it's, the figure that gets bandied around a lot is it'll grow 20 centimeters a day, and it's a very fast growing plant. So a lot of the interventions, unless it's almost like a eradication at a catchment level or a river level, then unless the pressure is maintained, then you tend to find only a temporary benefit. And that's the conundrum we face. Weeds don't wait. We're constantly up against the invasion curve with this. I mean, this is a site, Fairies Hill, Yorkshire, that was actually cleared, completely cleared 6 months prior to this photograph. And then the works discontinued and back it came. And in terms of how it spread, at the short distance from this photograph, there was a number of canal boats, and as you can see on this particular one, you can see that its fender has got infested with water primrose. Wherever it goes, bits will flake off, and it's just sort of dripping. If you wanted to design a vehicle for spreading floating pennywort, having a canal barge with pennywort dripping off the side is probably as good as it gets, really. And so that it's not surprising that that number of water bodies colonized by floating pennywort is continuing to rise. But the good news from a floating pennywort perspective is that we do have a really good partnership, and we've got really good engagement, some excellent volunteers. So we are seeing some really good localized success stories. We do have a range of resources which the Secretariat kindly hosts for us on their website. There's lots of really good information on floating pennywort available on the Secretariat website. We have methods that work, and we have an approach that works. And there, as I say, there are some areas that were blighted with pennywort that are now free of it. And moving on to sort of biological control, there is a weevil that has been introduced as a biological control of floating pennywort, and it's slowly showing promise. It's beginning to show evidence of control, and it's beginning to slowly disperse under its own steam. So it's not a quick fix. A classical biological control is not a quick fix, but at least it's the beginning of a strategic solution. And this is very, very poor quality images. I do apologize, but the story is nice. On the left-hand side is a infestation of water primrose that the weevil was seeded into, and on the right-hand side is actually the same site now dominated by watercress. And this is highlights one of the beauties of biological control, because it is so specific to your target weed. It's so much neater than chemicals or mechanical removal, which takes out good and bad. This is highly specific, and it happens on a gradual basis. And what it does is it takes away the advantage that the invasive species has, basically its lack of pests and diseases. And it creates a sort of level playing field so that native species can then recolonize, which is what we've seen here. So there's actually a variety of biological controls that have been introduced into the UK. In the top left is the Aphalara itidori, the knotweed psyllid, unfortunately, it's not been the game changer we hoped, but that's the nature of biological systems, and the work is still being undertaken. So we're hoping that we'll get something that's a better climate match for our knotweed. The other two on the top there is that is the Listernotus weevil for floating pennywort. It's the adult attacks the leaves, but the damage is really done by the larvae that burrow into the stolons, and it's the larvae that sort of make the rafts collapse and sink. So that little grub in the middle is the hero of that story. In the bottom left, you have Puccinia rust on Himalayan balsam. There's a bit of a myth. Everyone bangs on about cane toad, about biocontrol, but the cane toad was an act of vandalism. You should never use a vertebrate as a biocontrol. They're just generalist feeders. Most modern biocontrols are highly specific, co-evolved pests and diseases. And in the case of Himalayan balsam, it was actually almost too specific, because it turns out that we've had 3 introductions of Himalayan balsam from slightly different areas of its host range, which is India, Pakistan, Kashmir. And each of those introductions needs a slightly different Puccinia rust fungus for the biocontrol. So we're trying to find the perfect match between the rust fungus and the source of origin for our Himalayan balsam. But it is beginning to spread, and it hits the balsam in 2 growth stages. The leaves that you see here produce these dark spores that then litter the understory, and then in the spring, when the seedlings come up, those spores attack the seedlings and they become very etiolated and distorted. So it attacks the plant at 2 phases. And then on the right hand side is the mite that has been released against crassula, which is the Australian swamp stone crop. And if you look at the odd looking crassula in the very far bottom right hand side, you'll see that it's sort of got these red galls, and so this is a gall forming mite, which is intended to stunt the growth of crassula. Again, it's not been it's not been a widespread success. It's very hard to predict. It's easier to predict how safe something will be in terms of biocontrol. It's less easy to predict how effective it'll be. But these things take time. And if anyone ever tells you biocontrol is rubbish, it doesn't work, ask them about azolla, which is water fern, and they'll probably say, who cares about azolla? Well, we would care if we didn't have a biocontrol for it. Azolla would be a really serious invasive non-native species, and here you can see that sort of greeny red cover on a pond, and there are various videos on social media of people trying to walk across these surfaces because they think it's some sort of posh tarmac and disappearing rapidly into the depths. And having introduced the Stenopalmus weevil to this, the pond is absolutely clear, and which is quite unusual for biocontrol, and it's almost too effective because the weevil then dies off because it's eaten all its azolla, whereas really in a classical biocontrol you want a low level of the target weed to survive so that your biocontrol persists. I could go into details as to why they think it is so effective, but I could talk all day on that, but I won't. But it is nevertheless a really good success story of a biocontrol against an invasive non-native species. So just sort of, I want to sort of canter through a few other species. Pet hates of mine, this is one of them, American skunk cabbage. And there's a depressing recurring theme. They've been introduced usually from something like the Americas as an ornamental plant, and this is now listed as a species of concern. It's now banned from sale. It's still promoted in some quite popular gardens, etc. So we haven't properly demonized this, but when you see what it does to a wet woodland or a marsh, it really is, it forms a very dense monoculture, and it's really species like Caltha palustris, marsh marigold, native species such as that really suffer because of this. So there are various ways of getting rid of it. You can dig it up. It's not easy, especially when you consider how soft the mud is that you're often standing in when you're trying to do that. There are chemicals that will work against it, but you say from the map it is really well widespread now. So there's I would still encourage um, early intervention against American skunk cabbage if it's new to a catchment, So, but the opportunity for sort of eradication is long gone, I'm afraid. Parrot's feather is another quite a familiar one. Again, it's quite interesting. You see the distribution map. This is one that clearly, with climate change, is likely to spread further north. At the moment, there is a very strong southerly bias, and this one does suffer through winter frosts. And actually, it's a really good time to pull it up is just before a cold snap because you find that the propagules that inevitably arise from it if they become a lot less viable if you have cold weather afterwards. So if you've got a lake or something that with parrot's feather in, and you're thinking of getting rid of it, then it's quite a good idea to do that in late autumn, early winter, so that any propagules don't get a chance to re-establish. Now this is one that I hope it's going to be a prevention success story. So giant reed is an unusual one because it has a very long lag phase. So it's actually sit in the wild for hundreds of years sometimes before it becomes problematic. But when it does become a problem, it's a real problem, which is what they found in North America. And obviously this from our perspective is potentially a flood risk. It's where it does thrive, it's a very big dominant grass. So what we're hoping is that this will be listed as a species of concern. It'll be banned from sale, and it will basically hopefully prevent it from actually establishing in the wild. So this is hopefully an invasion that will never happen. One that's sort of happening is kabomba or fanwort. And again, it's a sort of aquarium or pond plant. Interestingly, the NBM map on the side is a bit out of date, really, because the site up at the Clyde Canal, where it was first found, is now believed to be extinct because it was only surviving there because of a thermal discharge that was stopped, and then it died out. But this is present now in the Basingstoke Canal, and there's about 20 kilometres of it. So it is growing. It is problematic in the Netherlands, but one of the problems we have with submerged aquatic plants is that we have quite a limited suite of options for managing them. We can't use glyphosate because glyphosate only works on emergent weed. Same with triclopyr. There were products that were such as terbutrine and diquat that were approved for use in or near water for submerged weeds, but those have now been they're no longer approved for use in or near water. So we have to basically dredge or pull out this plant, and that's not a good way to eradicate it. And similarly, this is an invasion that is just happening in front of our very eyes, really. A lot of the time now that the Garasiphon is sort of banned from sale, then it tends to be Igaria that's promoted as this sort of the myth of oxygenators. It's a bit of a spelling mistake there. Sorry about that. You don't need oxygenators, in a pond, because plants use oxygen as well as produce it. So it is useful to have plants in a pond, obviously, and it's quite a good way of sometimes controlling algae. But there are plenty of really good native species you could be using, and there is actually a really useful guide on the Secretariat website in terms of alternatives that you could be using instead of these invasive species. So this is one that unfortunately is beginning to spread, and unfortunately, because it's a submerged weed, there's probably very little we'll be able to do about it. And lastly, this is top tips. If you get reincarnated into a plant and you want to be invasive, then take a leaf out of the book of Pick-a-Back Plant, because it's got multiple common names. So people very rarely know which one you're talking about. It's got a completely forgettable scientific name. I normally got a pretty good memory for scientific names, but I can never remember this one. So it's a very forgettable plant, both through nomenclature, but also look at it. It's dead dull, and yet it's really widespread. 1,763 sites, and yet it's only now beginning to appear on our radar as an invasion that's happened, and we which largely went unnoticed. And it is scary where you do find this plant. It is really, really widespread, and it is dominating some wet woodlands. So top tip, there's a lot to be said for being boring and disappearing under the radar. To sort of summarize, what I've done is sort of canter through that hierarchy of management, and hopefully emphasize that campaigns like Be Plant Wise and Check Clean Dry are really important, cost-effective interventions. If they don't succeed, then you sometimes have an opportunity to eradicate the species before it establishes. Not always, certainly for a lot of aquatic animals, such as the invertebrates, once you've got them, there's very little you can do. But some of the plants, at least, we have a window of opportunity. And once those are established, you may be able to contain it, but also you can protect vulnerable areas. So if you have a site, sort of triple SI, for instance, that may be particularly vulnerable to certain invasive species, then you can put contingency plans in for a localized early intervention to protect those sites. And then for certain species, biological control is sometimes a strategic option. Not always. There's not always a natural enemy that is specific enough. And a lot of those biological control programs take about 10 years of research and over £1 million of investment before you have any possibility of a release. So, we shouldn't rely on that. It's great when we do have that option. But there are plenty of new threats out there, both in terms of new arrivals, but as our climate warms, there are a lot of species that had been benign that are now becoming invasive, and that lag phase for a lot of species is shrinking. So at that point, I will go over to questions.
Thank you, Trevor. That was great. And yeah, it's always kind of sobering to hear about these, but good to hear about the work that's going on, and then a good reminder of the things that everyone can do as well. So we've got quite a few questions in the box already. If people can type them into the chat box, I'll read them out for Trevor. So the first one was asking if there are any records of water primrose from the Norfolk Broads.
Not from the Broads as such. There are quite a few in East Anglia, and we're very sensitive to areas such as the Broads that are really vulnerable. So we do try to risk assess sites in terms of the threats they pose, and if anything gets anywhere near the Broads, then we will hopefully descend on it like a ton of bricks and prevent it becoming established, because the Broads would obviously be very vulnerable.
Yeah, that was from someone who went to a water garden that had this species and skunk cabbage growing by the dikes.
This species? Right, okay, I'd like a record of that, please.
Yeah, it can add information or contact us directly. Another question, well, one on biological control, which I think we've covered already, talks quite a lot about that. Someone asking whether introducing more native plants after the invasive ones have been removed, could that decrease the chance of recolonization?
Yes, yeah, it's a really good point. A good protection against biological invasions is a diverse, healthy habitat. So the more diverse, healthy habitats you have, the smaller the niches are for invasions. It's not always a guarantee, but it just helps, and it's a really important phase to any control program that you begin to think in terms of how the site should be remediated. Because if you leave it blank, then chances are it'll be an invasive non-native that comes in and fills that gap. So it should be seen as a process, a transition between an invaded habitat to a healthy native habitat rather than just an invasive species management program.
Yeah. One here on a native species actually. So asking if you've got any suggestions on eradicating water soldier, apparently a UK native but invasive outside of its typical range. I think they've got an issue with it in the Montgomery Canal.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, this is quite an interesting one because we tend to think in terms of non-native in terms of at a national level, and that's easier when you're an island. But there are species that have been moved from different parts of the UK to other parts, and things can become behave in an invasive fashion. Plus, there are a lot of native species that are invasive. Invasive behavior isn't unique to non-native species. Um, I I I would imagine I mean with things like water soldier, you'd probably be looking at a mechanical and manual removal, preferably if there's a large infestation. But from recollection, it should respond to glyphosate treatment. I I would need I would need to sort of research that to be sure in terms of bespoke advice. But it's not a particularly easy species to manage because of the sort of the ecology of it and its leaf site. So I know that it is a problem.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. Um, Someone's asked what measures are in place to make sure biocontrol agents don't become problems in themselves. Somebody's actually responded to that one, saying that they need extensive testing in the lab, but is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I always welcome um, that sort of healthy skepticism because we shouldn't be introducing biological controls. We shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have these species. But where we do have these established problems, then biocontrol um, has the potential to be a safe intervention. How do we know it's safe? Well, that's what the £1,000,000 gets spent on, basically. It's there's a range of stages to ensure that native species are protected. Um, and first of all, there's extensive literature search. So there's usually a pretty good indication of when you're looking for natural enemies in the host range, you can often discard 9/10 of them because they're clearly non-specific. They're generalist feeders. Um, then if you think you have a few contenders that appear to be fairly specific in the field, um, then you go through what's called host specificity testing, and there's a process called centrifugal phylogeny, which is one of my favorite expressions, where they basically look at the plants that are related to your target weed, and then they sort of work outwards in terms of the native species and the desirable crops, etc., that are in any way related to it. Because it's very rare for a co-evolved pest or disease to attack something that's completely dissimilar to the target weed. So it tends to be stuff that's related pretty similar. There's also quite a few important crops that get tested as a matter of routine anyway. And the testing is what's called a no choice test. So you basically put the biocontrol in with that target, with that native species, and you give it the option of eating it or dying. Um, and that, which is quite an extreme test. So, obviously in the wild, it would probably that's it would probably not be faced with that situation, but it's a pretty good way of telling whether it's physiologically capable of attacking non-native. It's not foolproof. It's pretty good, and to say a lot of the biocontrols suffer because actually the co-evolved pest is usually too specific. But there are no safe methods. Chemical control, mechanical control, all of these methods there's a non-target impact to it. The only thing that actually is totally safe is not introducing in the first place. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be very good at that.
Thanks, Trevor. One here on, so this person sees garden centre selling Myriophyllum brasiliensis often. Is that form of parrot's feather a workaround for Myriophyllum aquaticum, and is it equally considered a species of concern?
Oh, that argument's been raging for some time, and I've known botanists to get really quite heated on that debate. To what extent the red-stemmed Myriophyllum is a variety of aquaticum or not? I can't even remember where it sort of goes from one to the other at the moment. I don't know which camp we're currently in. I know that we're doing quite a bit of work on Brasiliensis to see whether there are examples of where it has become invasive. And it does appear to be a more benign version, but we don't know if that's simply because we're at an early stage in its lag phase. So the jury is out for that. My mentality is ban it anyway. We've got native myriophyllums. We could be, if you want a myriophyllum, have a native one. So I don't think we need this one. But this is one of the problems with when you ban a species, the trade that works around it by then importing a whole load of ones that are very closely related to it. And so you ban one hydrocotyledon, then you look on the shelves and there's three in its place. And there's a real risk with this because the biocontrols are highly specific. So if for instance, having spent 10 years finding a biological control for hydrocotyledon ranunculoides, floating pennywort, that's highly unlikely to work against the new hydrocotyledes that the trade have now replaced the banned species with. So there's a real danger with this habit that the trade have for working around these banned species lists.
Just wait for it to load. Yeah, we've got a question here asking how does water quality, for example, pollution or fertilizer runoff, affect invasive species establishment and eradication?
Yeah, it's another great question. A whole load of things that degrade habitats facilitate invasive species, basically. It's that point, your best protection is a really healthy, diverse habitat. But nutrient pollution in particular is a problem because what tends to be associated with invasive species such as floating pennywort is that profuse growth, and it can only grow profusely if nutrients are available. So in some ways they're almost a symptom of eutrophication. And one good way of managing that problem is by managing the nutrients going into the watercourse so that they are I'd like to see this captured a lot more in terms of discharge consents, because if you have a huge 1,000-ton raft of floating pennywort below a wastewater treatment works, then that is a manifestation of the nutrient status there. And one way of managing it is by managing those nutrient inputs.
Yep. A couple more have just come in. One asking, I'm going to butcher the name, how easy was it to get a permit for triclopyr? Did you get it because you're the EA?
I don't know, actually. I got to thank Dr. Jonathan Newman for this because I suspect he's so well respected with the pesticide safety directive, but it was easier than we anticipated. It's one of these things where you almost assume it's going to be really tricky, and then when you ask the question, they were really, really supportive, and you brace yourself for a nightmare process, but actually they were brilliant, and they just really helped us. So yes, a pleasant surprise, but something that I'm not prepared to squander. So we have a 3-year window of use for triclopyr, and I intend to spread it on as much water primrose as possible over those 3 years.
And is it species and site specific?
It's species specific. I think we're allowed to treat up to something like 30 hectares or something like. There's a sort of a limit to but that's more than the known population, combined populations of water primrose. So we won't have a problem with that. We do have to keep good records of its use, where it's used, how effective it is, etc. And it can only be used in or near water for water primrose. However, if you've got something like American skunk cabbage that isn't in or near water, there's no reason why you can't be using products like triclopyr against them. And I think they'd probably work quite well.
Yeah, thank you. An interesting one here. Do you think ultimately we'll be pushing to get to a stage where we ban all non-native aquatic species to avoid the seller workarounds you mentioned?
Oh, you know, you're talking a paradise as far as I'm concerned. There's a sort of arguments about what what used to be called whitelists and blacklists. I don't think it's like those are expressions that are encouraged anymore. But at the moment, we sort of have this blacklist where we list the ones that we don't want. Um, an alternative is to have a whitelist where you just say these are the ones that you are allowed to. And I've argued that from a point of view of aquatic species, there's so many of them are invasive that that's the approach we should have. Um, and you know there are plenty of perfectly benign pond plants that people can have. Lots of them are native, lots of them are extremely beautiful, and we don't need these. This is laziness on the point of view of people who produce plants, because these things are easy to grow. And so you know that you can understand the appeal, but we don't need them. You know, there are alternatives available.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. I think that's all of the questions we have. I'm just checking that no others have come in. I've added you mentioned a few links throughout your talks. I've added those to the chat box as well, so people can find them, like the alternatives guide and campaigns, and oh yeah, the information on managing floating pennywort. But yeah, I think that's everything. People can go to our website as well to find out more about Invasive Species Week. And yeah, I just want to say a big thank you to Trevor for a really great talk, and thank you very much everyone for joining as well, spending time in the webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much, and some really good questions. So I enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.